Welcome to the Agentic Self podcast, where we don't have the answers and we know where you can find them. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Patricia Ockney, your host of the Agentic Self podcast. The episode today, it's essentially on connection. As a private practice psychotherapist, as a critical incident responder, a coach, the systems person, understanding how we interact with the environment, with other humans, and the systems around us are going to help us to be healthier. It's going to help us make more mindful choices every day. The more we're connected to this system here. So I like to call it the human operating system. So, that includes your mind, your body, and your spirit. And your spirit is essentially what gets you up in the morning every day, wants you to do a good job, wants to make things better than they were before, what lights you up and drives you. Connection, to me, I would describe it as medicine, essentially. Connection is medicine, and we can't really get to connection to ourselves without stepping into present moment, which means we're not in the fantasy future or the past and replaying those decisions that we made or experiences that we've had, whether it be capital T trauma experiences, like really significant trauma, or little t traumas. So those impact our central nervous system. We call that adverse childhood events when that happens in those early years. You may have heard of the ACEs, that is adverse childhood events. So the ACEs helps us understand how much trauma you may have experienced as a human organism in the environment that you grew up in. And what we do know about trauma is it tends to have a dose effect. So the more trauma that we've experienced, it's sort of stackable, the bigger impact that it can have on our nervous system. There are so many factors involved, including our socioeconomic background, education, the resources that we have available to us. There's a number of factors at play that either supports and creates a container for connection or does not. And so on today's podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about what healthy connection looks like, where that begins in early childhood, and how that plays out later in our lives. We need to keep in mind that the mind is malleable. It is changeable. It is, as they used to describe 20 or 30 years ago, like plastic. So we are able to create new connections, new pathways, and that is truth, science, fact. I can't change it. It's just who I am, that sort of thing. That's a real kind of defeatist attitude because you are what you decide you are. And you can create a sense of safety within this vessel. So we're going to get into it and talk about connection as medicine. I like to think of a theme song for each episode. And the theme song I chose for today's episode is Stand By Me, which is by Ben E. King. And so I'm not going to sing for you today, but the line, when the night has come and the land is dark, what does that conjure? When things get dark, when we can't see direction, we don't know where we're going to go. It is unclear. The path is unclear. That song has endured for generations because it's a thread within us all. Things always get dark. And what we do know is that the light and the sun always rises every day. So we can choose when things get dark to look for the light and to know and remember that the light always does come back because there's laws of this universe that we don't get to circumvent, and that's one of them. The sun will rise tomorrow, light will come, and by golly, it will get dark again too. And I think when we can live within that acceptance of darkness and light, and that we are kind of flowing within that, and we really have little control about when it gets dark, don't we? And we don't have control of when the sun comes up. But what we do have control of is our attention, our consciousness. What are we tuning into? And are we looking for more light, which I'd like to put connection under light, because connection is what brings us light. It brings us levity. It brings us hope. It brings us into our common humanity. Connection is something that humans require for survival. We are born into relationship. We're born into connection with those who brought us into the world, if we are lucky. So, if we were to think back or look back, I guess, to some of those early philosophers, we have Aristotle 2,300 years ago identifying that we are social animals. We require relationship to survive from day one. It is the only way we have stayed here. It's the only way we have survived is in connection with other humans. And so to me, logically, the only way we're going to, I like to call SOS, save ourselves or save our souls. I think it both of those apply. We have to learn to connect again in an economy that's driving disconnection. So we have to resist. And how do we resist? Well, first we have to recognize the patterns. We have to recognize our own patterns and where we fit and what we can do to create more connection to ourselves in our lives and our relationships with others, whether that be those we choose or those people that we work with, work under. So essentially, we've known for a long time that human beings are wired for connection. We don't simply enjoy connection, we depend on connection. No infant born into this world survives without connection. No human being flourishes in the absence of connection. So today we're going to explore a little bit about some of those important questions. What happens when we disconnect from ourselves, aka abandon ourselves? That's one of those little examples when we say yes when we really mean no. I like to call that the dirty yes, which I'd rather have a clean yes. Somebody who's saying yes because they've scanned their resources, their energy, and their values and their desire. And I would like to have a clear, direct answer, whether it's a yes and not an obligation. I feel like I have to, I owe you one, that sort of thing. So being in connection with ourselves helps guide us. What do I need to do in this moment? What's the next best step for me? What is the right path? So when we find ourselves in disconnection, which keeps me in business because I'm called in when people become disconnected to themselves for all the very good reasons. Remember, it's person plus environment. There's not one person that I've ever worked with in my career who is choosing disconnection from themselves and choosing disconnection from others. We're driven into disconnection. And unless you know the pathway out, which is the most important thing in my work, is how do we find our way back home? How do we find our way back into connection to ourselves so that we may be an authentic, good connection with others, which is going to elevate us all and also reduce violence, which is my goal, is to reduce violence in the world. And it all begins within ourselves. So to start off, again, I've alluded to those early years, the connection that is formed when we are born. Connection really precedes identity. We get all wrapped up in who we are and what we represent and, all of that important conditioning, I would say, that we have. I mean, I'm not saying it's not good to have goals and work hard and achieve, but when we attach to these identities, it really limits. It is, and I've spoken about this earlier, it's like putting blinders on. We're not seeing, the vastness of ourselves, of others, of perspectives, of different situations, because the brain, again, really likes certainty and likes to get locked into what we know for sure. And unfortunately, I think it's a good strategy when we think we know something for sure, we feel it in our bones, like this is it, to have the courage to step back and question and get curious, because it might not be it. There might be a chemical hit happening that feels familiar. And so the body's feeling like, yes, yes, but it might not be. It might not be. So we have to take that sober second thought and get curious about the certainty that we're making decisions based on. And again, connection happens before the identity, before language, before achievement, before personality, and it happens in relationship. We are relational beings. We got sick together as a herd, and we need to heal together. And I know, working with people for a long time, if I had $1 for every time, and I myself as well have said, I just want to go to a cabin in the woods by myself and be at peace. There is that feeling of wanting to isolate when we've been hurt, when the world is falling apart and doesn't make sense, when there's injustice all around us. There is a desire to escape it. There's a desire to leave these connections and go on our own. But We can't survive alone is quite simply. And so we need to return to the herd and relationally heal. And that begins with a relationship with yourself. So we know infants, we're vulnerable. We're vulnerable mammals. And to survive, we need to have caregivers who are going to meet our needs when we have them. Those needs when you're a baby, I need my diaper changed. I need to be fed. I need to be kept safe. I need to feel secure and protected. So we need love. And how does a baby communicate that? Call and response. Baby calls, mom, dad, caregivers respond. Meet baby's needs. Baby then feels, okay. I'm regulated. I'm getting my needs met. I send a signal. Someone calls, comes. I send out a call, somebody answers. That's relational. That is how our children are shaped. It's the nervous system wiring in those early years that sets us up for life. And some of us didn't get the response when we call. And then we have some chemical reactions that happen, like cortisol, that then can flood the body and sends a message. And that is wiring our system as well. So there's a science behind the nervous system and how we're showing up in the relationship with ourselves. Can I trust myself to get my needs met? Can I trust other people to meet my needs? All of that happens before you even know you're a human being separate from your mother. I forget the age that it is that we become aware that we're separate beings, but from the beginning, we don't really recognize that we're separate. And I wish kind of that we still had that because we are interacting with each other, creating each other's existence through our words, through the things we're not saying, through the things we're doing, through the things we're not doing. It's all based on relationship. So that's a little bit about attachment and co-regulation because that's what we're doing. We're regulating with each other, and there's a lot of science behind that. And I'm certainly not an expert. I have some training, but I'm not a neuroscientist. And so, but these things we know are true. Attachment theory is real. Co-regulation is real. Our hormones, our chemicals, our oxytocin, our mirror neurons, all of it matters. And most of us didn't get that training. We didn't get that manual. And again, that's what keeps me in business is people are seeking the manual. How do I operate this system? This human operating system. That's what I like to call it, the human operating system. So our first operating system is this, right? It's this. We are figuring it out. And one of the things that we learn relationally, as children is, do I belong? Do I matter? Can I trust? Can I explore? Can I discover things about my world? Can I leave my caregivers, my parents' side and go explore in the sandbox or out in the garden? Do I feel safe enough to go and do that? And those early relational experiences determine whether safety is felt or not. And guess what, folks? That also applies to our workplaces because the system that was wired at home for fear, for avoidance, for dysregulation, and then you're in a work environment where the policies and the procedures or the leadership or the management or supervisors aren't trained to show up in a safe way that allows people to flourish and grow and be at their best. If those conditions are not met and you have a system that doesn't feel safe, you can imagine how that gets exacerbated. And I used to work in return to work, helping people get back to the workplace. So I have a lot of stories of leaders and managers and supervisors who struggle to have difficult conversations with their employees. Sometimes they walk past things that are their responsibility to not walk past. I was really pleased to see psychological health and safety become more of a priority here in Nova Scotia with some changes to the legislation. It is a drop in the bucket. We have a lot further to go. And a lot of the ways we can increase safety in our workplaces are free, they are evidence based, and they are available. The one factor that's preventing a lot of workplaces from making these changes is the will of the leadership, the CEOs, the senior leadership team, the overwhelmed already HR who's carrying a lot already, I would say. And we really can't make cultural changes to workplaces if the leaders are not invested in it, if there's not an actual budget set aside to create safety in the workplace and to do trainings, a lot of it is communication. It's communication of our leaders so that they can show up whole at work and lead to keep people engaged. How do you get engagement? It's got to be safe and people need to feel valued. So I've already talked about the most important relationship. I will keep repeating that. I had some feedback today on my podcast so far that they do enjoy the repeating of the same concept and reminding because you have to get these things in your bones. I will keep repeating the same things. If you are interested in developing your own communication with yourself, and communication with others, this is the podcast for you because we're going to be tying our own communication with ourselves with actually achieving some scary goals. So, fear, how are we facing fear? How are we showing up in courage and love for ourselves so that we can achieve our missions? If fear is driving the bus and you're sitting in the back, then you're not going to get to where you're going. We have to get up, drive to the front, ask fear, hey, we've been doing this a long time. I know your patterns. I know what sets you off. I know why you're here. I know that you're trying to keep me safe. And it's not really working. So thank you for your service, fear. Get to the back of the bus. I am driving now. How do we do that? We begin in here. What is scaring us? What are the stories that we are telling ourselves when fear shows up? What can we inoculate fear with? Hint, self-compassion, grace, love, pretty simple inoculants. Very difficult to do if your programming says, that's not for you. You don't give yourself grace. You don't give yourself self-compassion. That's for other people. And then you continue the flagellation of yourself and not really enjoying or learning or growing because you've internalized that shaming. So we want to move away from that sort of narrative. And so paying attention to the mind, what the mind is telling us is very important to get to know yourself. And one of the ways I help people to figure out if the way that they're speaking to themselves is the way that they would like to is to ask themselves, would I want my child to talk to themselves the way I'm talking to myself when I make a mistake? Is that how I want my best friend, my colleagues, my partner to speak about themselves to themselves? It's a really good gauge to get curious if, what's the saying? What's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if you're a parent and you're raising your child, teaching the skills of self-love, self-acceptance, compassion, grace, but inside when you make a mistake, you are beating yourself up. Make no mistake about it. The children are absorbing that because it's an energy. A lot of what we're communicating to our kids is through energy. It's not through words. I can say, hey, Callum, Finley, Isla, I need you to do this. Well, they observe me doing this. There's a disconnect. And we all know that behavior teaches more than words. So many people spend their lives, beating themselves up and not enoughing it, as a client and I came up with that term, not enoughing it. I'm not enough at this, not enough at that. And it's a pattern, it's a generational code that needs to be upgraded. It needs to be interrupted. The code is not getting us the outputs that we desire and that our world needs. We don't need more disconnection. We don't need more internalized violence because what happens when there's internalized violence? Yeah, it gets externalized. It has to. It has to go somewhere. So we need to understand what the difference is between when we're performing and when we're being, when we're pleasing and when we're knowing, when we're achieving and when we're belonging. And they're not mutually exclusive, but we have to get really clear on what is being communicated within ourselves so that we can take the action that's in alignment with the outputs we desire, where we're trying to go. Maybe it's a better relationship with ourselves, our children, our colleague, our workplace colleagues, our boss. So, so connection is giving that body signals some validity, the feelings you're having, the emotions that you're having, how your intuition is showing up, that gut feeling. Is it a gut feeling that's directing you somewhere, or is it an old legacy program that's making you feel a certain way? How do you discern an ACEs example, a past trauma response versus a gut feeling. That's a difficult one. And how do we get there? How do we get to clarity? It's getting to know ourselves and meeting ourselves and actually documenting, which is a huge part, is actually taking some notes. I encourage people to use their phones and have a note section where they might jot down some thoughts that they were having about something, or a feeling that they have to, we don't all have time to reflect. We're busy. So when you do have a moment to reflect, to get curious, what was that about? What was I looking for there? What did I need? Why was I afraid to say the thing? If I go back, what would I do differently? And that's what's going to help us grow, right? But that requires some sense of safety and curiosity, that you want to know more about you and your human operating system, and that you're willing to look at some of the things that maybe you don't want to see, because a lot of times those things are driving the bus. So now that we know a little bit about what connection looks like, feeling the feelings, the emotions, understanding what we need and what we don't need in a given moment, being in presence, not being in the future or the past, but being in the moment and connecting to what's happening right now. That's how I would describe connection. And I also think it's important to look at, well, what does disconnection look like, if that's what connection is? And disconnection often disguises itself as success. I know nobody wants to hear that. But sometimes we don't get to success through connection. Sometimes we get to success through disconnection, through being driven. That's why I think it's important to remember, we don't want to change who we are. We're not looking to change who we are. We're just looking to understand, like to approach ourselves like a science experiment. That's my favorite approach, is to think of this human operating system as a science experiment. How is it interacting with the environment around it? In these different environments, how is this organism, this human operating system, acting when it goes home to our family of origin? A lot of times we can have some responses when we go home, or a toxic work environment, or a safe work environment. What does it feel like to be in a safe work environment? I can remember back to my early years, early 20s, and going on a training to the big city, Halifax. I was living in Amherst. That's where I'm born, Amherst, on a beef and dairy farm there. And I was working in a human services role and was sent on some training. That training, actually, ironically, is all about attachment. It's all about connection. So I started this journey back in my 20s, training with Dr. Benoit. I think her name was, out of Toronto. She is I believe, a PhD doc who, her primary research is in moms and babies and attachment theory. And so that training was a 3-day intensive where we observed, we watched videos, we coded data, we understood how baby and mom were interacting, and when mom left the room, how did baby respond, and went through a lot of the clinical trials, or research, I should say, where a lot of this data was captured on video, and we learned how to do those assessments. So I always feel really privileged to have done that training, because that was all before I had children. And I'm so grateful, because again, children don't have manuals. They don't come with a manual. And I was lucky enough to have a little bit of a manual of how to show up for them, how to create a container for connection, secure connection, how to make sure safety was felt, and security and protection. So, and I teach that. I have a lot of parents who come into my practice before they have children, which I think is great. I've had a number of dads come into my practice because they didn't want to repeat the same patterns of disconnection. Our parents and that generation before us, I'm 50 now, they're not interested in connection. Like, we're all doing what we were taught. And, the pendulum goes and it comes and it goes. And I think some of us get on the extreme of those things. But if we just look at what's in the center, of the polarities, and it's usually a theme through all of us, is the need for connection. So the signs, what does disconnection look like? And sometimes it shows up with chronic busyness. When we don't want to feel, when we don't want to think, when there's grief present in our bones, we often treat it with busyness, chronic busyness, never stopping, overscheduling. And that gets passed down onto the kids as well. Hyper independence, that's another sign of a disconnection. I don't need anyone. I can do it all myself. I don't trust anyone. There's been some harms caused there, and usually, rightly so. We become hyper independent. And I want to make sure I'm clear here that disconnection is more common than not now, it seems. I am biased. Obviously, I work in this field. So everyone who's coming to see me has some form of disconnection. I have disconnection. We all have forms of disconnection in our lives, and for very good reason. It's like I said earlier, the little t and the big T traumas. So this isn't a judgment. This is a state of the human operating system when needs aren't met, when signals aren't responded to. Then we have a state of dis-ease, not disease, but dis-ease. I am not medical model. Yes, I'm a clinician. Yes, I have a license to practice. Yes, I have to keep up my trainings, my education. However, the medical model is problematic when it comes to shame, and shame is highly correlated with disconnection. So, for good reason, again, I want to say. So, disconnection looks like isolation, looks like cynicism, often looks like anger and resistance, resentment, perfectionism, my personal favorite, workaholism, and emotional numbness. That's a common one. Burnout, another one that's quite common in my work. So these are disconnected states, right? Where we're bypassing the body's signal saying you need to rest, you need to sleep, you need nutrients, you need water, you need love. Those are signs that we're out of connection when we're not tuning into those signals that our body is giving us. Something else that's really important for us to remember is that disconnection is often a strategy of protection. Disconnection is often a non-conscious mind strategy to keep ourselves safe. And I do simplify things a lot, and I do believe that most of us human beings are seeking safety most of the time. That's how we survived. And I would never say anyone is wrong for seeking safety, for seeking comfort, for seeking connection and common humanity. The problem is we like to judge others' behaviors that we deem unacceptable who are seeking connection. And I invite all of us to consider perhaps when we see behaviors in others that are one of the most common ones that makes me sad when I hear it is they are just looking for attention. Maybe it breaks my heart because I was that. I am that. Come on, I'm starting a podcast. I ran for politics. I might be attention seeking. Yeah. And I'm learning that you kind of need to get attention in order to grab a pair of ears to bring people in instead of calling people out. I am so exhausted with the call out cancel culture. And really, this podcast is a little bit of resistance to that because can we just stop? Can we maybe stop pointing out where other people stumble or fall or choose the wrong words or have the wrong ideology? Could we maybe consider holding a mirror to ourselves and where we're hold a mirror to ourselves so that we may notice where we ourselves are disconnected. It is so much more intoxicating to point out where other people are stumbling and falling, where they're not doing it right or didn't do it right, or where we could have done it much better. How's that feel? To be in that position of knowing sometimes it sounds like maybe you're better. Sounds like you know exactly what's going on with that person and what they need and what they don't need. Or maybe you sound like a pompous ass and you need to step back and consider how would you like somebody to show up for you on your darkest day when you're in struggle, When you make a choice not aligned with your values and your beliefs, how would you like to be held in that moment? Something to think about. I try not to throw stones from my glass house. I think it's a good strategy because throwing stones is just creating more disconnection. A dragon will always find a slayer. I heard that today. Violence with violence. Pretty sure that's not the answer. Eye for an eye. Another reason why the podcast exists so that we can talk about that and bring people on to share the ways that they've found their courage to not react, not retaliate, not seek revenge. So, connection versus disconnection. We've talked a little bit about what disconnection looks like, a little bit what connection looks like. I'm just going to list a few of the key pieces again around connection. So, it's able to stay present. So, if we're going to be in connection, our central nervous system isn't in chaos, it isn't overfunctioning, it isn't, flipped from the executive functioning back to the survival part of our brain that is trying to keep us safe. So we want to kind of stay in present moment and be in our bodies to be able to allow what's happening and to be able to think and make decisions versus disconnection where we're running away or we're fighting or we're trying to please someone. So connected humans are often present. They are curious. They're open. They're not deciding a situation. They're flexible, cognitively flexible, not physically flexible, but cognitively flexible. Compassionate. Don't we all want compassion on our darkest day when we make a mistake? Yes, we do. Grounded. We're grounded. We know who we are. We know what we need and don't need. We are connected to our own values and beliefs. And authentic. A connected person is often an authentic person. They're not showing up with smoke and mirrors, trying to present or perform in a particular way to whatever it might be. So they're authentic. And yes, we're all in performance in some capacity, but we know when we're in performance to get a job done and it's just part of our identity for what we do for work. There's many different facets to our identity, and as long as the authentic one is showing up, so when we make a mistake, we can admit that and be honest about it. We can share what we're really thinking and feeling about something. We're able to set boundaries with people and not feel guilt or shame. Those are ways that you can identify a healthy human connected operating system. And again, the counter to that is reactivity, defensiveness, fear, rigidity, avoidance, isolation, and a very common one that I see in my practice is controlling. A lot of times when we feel out of control, we reach to control things around us. We see in the research that people who have a healthy, regulated system are able to adapt and have all of those positive attributes of a healthy connection with themselves. We see reduced anxiety, depression. We see greater happiness, longer lifespan, greater ability to practice resilience, and better overall cardiovascular health, which is a reduction in stress. So we all know that heart disease is the number one killer in the world. And so that is directly related to our lifestyles. That is directly related to our ability to metabolize stress. So I always talk to the people I get to work with, how much I care about their heart. And I don't mean their heart. I mean their actual physical vortex that's pumping everything that's kind of central, that we want to take care of that, and in order to do that, we have to develop a deep connection to ourselves. We have to know when we're taking care of this vessel and when we're not, because we want to be doing more of the taking care than we want to do of the disconnection. So the opposite of thriving is not struggle. The opposite of thriving is disconnection. So I ask you now, this is a call to action because we actually want to interrupt some patterns. We want to inspire you to pick up a pen and start documenting your human operating system. What do you notice? What are the signs? What are the signals? What does connection look like specifically for you? What I'm sharing here about connection is what I've learned, what I know, and it might be different for you. And there's no one way. If somebody tells you this is the way it is, this is, you know, question it, always question it. Like the podcast says, what do I say? What's my tagline? The agentic self. What's my tagline? Oh God, I can't remember my tagline. I just said it. The agentic self, where we don't have the answers and we know where you can find them. You have all the answers within you. It's not baloney. It's for real, yo. Like, really, you do have the answers within you. How your nervous system has been regulated may be keeping you from some of those answers. That is why presence is medicine. If we can call ourselves in to be present with ourselves, to get curious and kind and compassionate, we're going to learn about this system and then we can calibrate it. We can recalibrate it. You didn't choose how it was calibrated to begin with. That is so important to remember. You didn't choose how it's wired, and you can choose now. It is hard work. It is a lot of energy. The brain likes to take shortcuts, and you feel like going to a cabin in the woods a lot, and it's worth it. And you can come out the other side healthier and more whole. And all that you need to do is to step more into connection to yourself. All you need to do is if it's easy, it's not easy. I take that back. So I'm going to go over a little bit of the framework that I use to help people to be more in connection with themselves, because I think it's helpful to learn about it and practice and circle back and augment and recalibrate. And part of the reason I want to do this podcast and YouTube channel is to provide this for free. So those people who are interested in learning this, and if it feels right for them, that they can practice it. So the framework is quite simple. The mirror, what am I noticing? Where am I disconnected in my life? And start writing some of that down. What does that look like? We have the flashlight after we have the mirror. So we're looking, where am I disconnected? We're documenting some of that. And so we hold the mirror in a loving, compassionate way, curious way. And then we get a flashlight and we get even more curious. Why does this make sense? Because usually everything makes sense. A behavior is serving a purpose. The choices that we are making are aligned with how in connection we are with ourselves and those around us. What ways have we adapted? Did I have a harsh upbringing? Did I become harsh or did I become soft? What happened in my story related to my connection to myself that's showing up today? Was I taught to value my body? Was I taught to love myself, be kind to myself? Was I taught accountability and responsibility, two key pieces for connecting to yourself and building self-trust? The map. So we've got the mirror. So we're holding the mirror. What do I see? Flashlight, digging in. Why? What's that about? What could be beneath that pattern? And then the map. So what is an action that I can take on the path to where I'm going? What can I do that isn't a perfection step, that isn't a disconnection step, but it's a step towards connection? So that's just a really simple framework for the agentic self that can help us get a little more clear. And I have a quote for the episode. I chose Carl Jung's loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. So a quote for this podcast that I would like to share is from Carl Jung. Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. I would say the deepest loneliness that we as humans can feel is maybe not separation from others, but from the separation from our true authentic self. And maybe people around us are also profoundly lonely because they're not in connection with themselves either. And so what does it look like if we have a population full of lonely, disconnected people? We might see a lot of people on their phones. We might see a lot of people at VLT machines, casinos, online now. We might see a lot of people drinking and smoking and watching porn. We might see a lot of violence and reactivity. That's what I notice when we talk about disconnection. And I would like to create opportunities to inoculate that disconnection and challenge ourselves to connect back to what matters. I think that's the only way we're going to reduce violence in the world is if we start to reduce violence within ourselves. I think we've lost an authentic voice, and I think it's time we reclaim what's within us. And so, just to close this podcast, I want to invite people to consider how connection is showing up for them. Were you born into a connected home, a connected family? Do you see that you were shaped by connection and disconnection? And that in order for us all to heal, connection is the pathway, and it begins with you. Connection is remembering who you were before fear, before performance, before protecting yourself and being conditioned to hide. Connection is what happened before the world stepped in and told you you were not enough. And maybe now it's time to connect back in to yourself. And I'll just wrap up with a quote from Carl Jung. Know all the theories, master all the techniques, but as you touch a human soul, be just another human soul. We are all walking each other home after all.